So good day, friends. This is Dr. Bob Hamilton, and you have tuned into the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Thank you for making us part of your day. It means a lot to me. I know that you're all busy people. Your grandparents, your parents, you're doing things out there. You're trying to make ends meet in your jobs. So the fact that you've tuned into this podcast means a lot to me. So thank you for being here. If you like what you hear, share it with friends, share it with your family. We're building an audience, and the reason we're building an audience, why it's important, is because every week I bring you amazing people, and today is no exception to that. It is such a pleasure today to welcome to the Hamilton Review author Larry Loftis. Larry Loftis, welcome to the Hamilton Review.
Thank you, Dr. Hamilton. Glad to be here.
And who is Larry Loftis? Well, he's going to tell us a little bit more about himself, but I'll tell you who he is. He is a New York Times best-selling and international best-selling author of 3 nonfiction thrillers, one called The Prince's Spy, another one, the codename Lise, and the final one, Into the Lion's Mouth. These are nonfiction thrillers, by the way. He has been published in multiple languages around the world. And before he became a writer, he was a corporate attorney. We're going to talk about that maybe, Larry. But the book we're going to talk about today is a recently published book. It's called The Watchmaker's Daughter. It is about the story of Corrie ten Boom. And I'm going to let Larry tell us a little bit about Corrie ten Boom. But before we get to that point, Larry Loftis, tell us a little bit about who you are and where you're from and the points along your journey in life that made you who you are today.
Sure. I was born in Dallas, but I grew up from age 12 on in Orlando, so I'm a Floridian. And I fall into that category of people who couldn't figure out what they wanted to do when they grew up. And so I didn't really find out what I wanted to do, what I felt like God called me to do, until I was 50. So in the interim, when I was in high school, I want to be a lawyer. I'll go to law school. That's got a great career. It's safe. It's good money. So I did that, and I went to the University of Florida for both undergrad and law school. And I wrote on to the law review, which is you need to do if you want to get a big job, high-paying firm in Atlanta or Miami or New York or someplace. So I wrote on to the law review and did pretty well practicing law, and I did that for decades, for a long time. And after about 18 months, I knew this probably isn't what I'm supposed to be doing, but it's what I'm called to do right now.
So you were at after you graduated law school, 18 months into your job, you said, you felt like you made a mistake?
Well, not that I made a mistake, because law school trains you how to think. Probably better than anything else. It trains you how to think, how to weigh and sift evidence, all of which I use in my writing, by the way. But you have all of this training and writing and evaluating and judging, and you have hearsay exceptions, all those things. And so those things God would eventually use in what I do now, writing World War II books. But for me, the frustrating part was, well, I'm a lawyer now. This is not really what I feel called to do long term. What do I do in the interim? So about a decade into this, I decided to go to seminary. I'd been at my church for a long time, been teaching Sunday school for years and years and years, and I thought I think I'm supposed to go to seminary. So I went to seminary, Reformed Theological Seminary, which has a campus here in Orlando, and graduated, and thought about pastoring for a while. And then I realized, well, I'm more on the academic side. Maybe I'll become a theologian. And two of my professors had gotten their PhDs at Oxford, and one of them really wanted me to go to Oxford, and made the calls and did all that. So I was prepared. I'd already worked on my whole dissertation. I was this close to leaving to go for a PhD at Oxford, already been accepted into the early program. And at the last minute, I thought, this is kind of nuts, because, I've got all of my student loans, which I've paid off, and then all of my law school student loans, which I've paid off. And now I've gone through seminary and paid all that off out of savings. And I thought, I think this would be financial suicide if I left to go to Oxford for 3 to 5 years, making nothing and paying all this money. So I nixed that. And then I just kind of went through this long process. I've been writing, by the way, ever since law school. They published my case comment in the law review, and then I got published in 2 other university law reviews at University of Georgia and Suffolk University, and then the ABA Journal, the National Bar Journal, and all that stuff. So at that point, I thought, well, if nothing else, I can write. I know I can write. I can do research. I know how to do citations. And then, long and short of it is, about the time I hit 50, still practicing law, I thought, what if I switch gears and try to write a book? And so a guy that I went to college with was a great guy, Mike. He had two. We were in the same fraternity, and his name to you guys is Michael Connolly. Well, to me, he was Mike in room 17 in my fraternity house. He was 3 years ahead of me, I think. But I thought,
hold on. Are you talking about the Michael Connolly of Michael Connolly? You're talking about the author? Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, all the books, all the movies, yeah, all that.
Okay.
So he's just Mike to me, and I thought, well, if Mike can do, because I saw Mike as a normal person, and I thought, well, if Mike can do it, and why can't I? I mean, he was just a journalist. Here I've gone to law school, I've got all this training, and I thought, well, if he can do it, maybe I can do it. A friend handed me a Vince Flynn book, and I got so excited about thrillers. So then when I started my first spy book, which is Into the Lion's Mouth, which is that red one right there, I tried, went through the process of getting an agent, finally got an agent. He said, is most of this story true? And I said, yeah, it's all true. And he said, well, why don't you just do it as straight narrative nonfiction? I go, oh, okay. That's even better, because now I get to do citations and endnotes as I would in any law review article. So that process is all the same. In law review, basically every sentence of fact where you put out a definitive fact, you have to have a citation for it. So the court or the court's clerk can go and research to see if you got it right.
Yeah.
So that trained me to do narrative nonfiction with a lot of endnotes and citations. So all of my books are 100% true. Even the dialogue comes from primary sources. I don't create anything. I don't create events, anything. It's all 100% accurate of what happened. And so the footnotes or the endnotes are quite lengthy, because I want to cite it for people that want to dig.
Yeah.
So when
by the way, the book that we're going to talk about today, I'm just looking. I have it in my hand, and Larry, listen, there are a lot of notes in this, and a lot of bibliography. The whole thing. You clearly did your homework when you wrote this book. So incredible. So you're right. You do annotate, and you do back up everything you have written with real information, which to your credit, because a lot of people don't do that. That takes a lot of work and effort.
No different than you would as a doctor when you're submitting a medical journal article. You have to have clinical trials. You have to have things that you can point to say this is accurate and here's why.
Exactly, and you clearly have done that. So you have written books, and this is what you do now. This is your job.
Yep.
And you decided to write a book about a very important person. Her name is Corrie ten Boom, and the book is entitled "The Watchmaker's Daughter." So why did this particular story about Corrie ten Boom and her family strike you as something that you wanted to write about?
Sure. Well, and this is The Watchmaker's Daughter, and if you look right above that book to the book that's right there,
yep,
Codename Lise is where I found out about Corrie ten Boom. When I was doing research for Codename Lise, which is about a spy, an SOE agent operating in France, I've got a very good friend from church who's a kind of my beta reader, and she said, you have to read The Hiding Place. And I was familiar with Corrie, I was familiar with The Hiding Place, but I'd never read it. And I said, why? I know who she is, I know about that story. And she said, because, Larry, at the same time that Odette Sampson is in the German Ravensbrück concentration camp for women, Corrie ten Boom's there at the same time.
Hmm.
So my character in this book right here was a convicted spy. She was already condemned to death. They put her in a bunker, no lights. She saw nothing. She was in this hole. She saw nothing. Whereas Corrie is on the outside. She's in the regular barracks. So she sees all the stuff that happens every day, all the lineups, the roll calls, the beatings, everything. So her perspective gave me the other side. So my person's down in the bunker, Corey's on the outside. And if you look in Codename Lise, you'll see citations to the hiding place because I'm pulling things that Corrie had said about the camp. So that's how I sort of found out about felt like I need to do this story. And I have to answer this question with all of my books is, well, there's already a book out there. Is there more? What would your book bring to the table? And from doing my prior books, all of which had prior books about them, biographies or autobiographies, I realized that if not most of the time, a lot of the time, it's only part of the story. And I figured that Corrie's The Hiding Place was maybe 10% of the story. So I have to do all the research. And by the way, all this stuff, with the war is classified until about the 80s. So I found out her archives are at Wheaton College in the Billy Graham Center.
Yeah.
So I go there, spend 4 days coming through everything, all of her papers, all the prison letters, all the photographs, her scrapbooks, everything about the Bayet, the guest book for the Bayet. I mean, everything about her life, because those were all hers. They were all submitted to Billy Graham was a friend of hers. So she decided to house everything at the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton College. So I went through all that. And anyway, so what I found out was that The Hiding Place was only 10% of the story. And some of what was left out is very dramatic. The second most important person in The Hiding Place story and Corrie's story is a young 18-year-old Dutch boy named Hans Poley. He's the first permanent refugee into their home where they were hiding people. He stayed longer than anybody else, 9 months. He's the one that got them involved in the resistance. He's the one that got Corrie involved in the resistance. He had to go to prison like most of these other people. He's not even in the story,
Yeah.
which was crazy because, and I kind of know why. Corrie didn't write anything in The Hiding Place. If you look on the book, the names underneath are John, Elizabeth, Cheryl. That's who wrote 100% of the book, and she points that out in multiple newsletters in her files. But she did write an autobiography in 1947 called A Prisoner and Yet. But it was a very small book. It was published by an obscure Christian publisher. No one really read it. Didn't get any exposure. So a couple decades later, the Sherrills hear about her, saw the autobiography, and said, "Hey, can we redo your story?" So,
Larry, let me back up a little bit here because a lot of people don't know who Corrie ten Boom is. So would you kind of lay out in a simple way who this person is, because and a little bit her story and how she fit into how she ended up in Ravensbrück. Maybe that's so. Maybe start with the very beginning. Okay.
You have to start with the ten Boom family, and it just talks. You have to. Dennis Prager, by the way, talks about this often. The importance of a father in the home, and Corrie's everything about her, and Betsy and the other two children, Nolly and Willem. Their whole being was sort of crafted by the history of the sort of leaders of the family. Her father, they loved their father Casper, who was a spiritual giant, and he's in the 80s. He's in his 80s when the story starts, but he was a very godly man. And then his father and his father's father. So all the way back to Corrie's grandfather, that you have this history of these very godly men who love Israel, pray for Jerusalem, and that was kind of like almost unknown in Holland at the time.
Right.
So that generational great grandfather to grandfather to Corrie's father, all that lineage is passed down. So for Corrie, by the time it gets to her, for her family, I mean, prayer was like breathing. They prayed before every meal, and Casper before lunch, before dinner, he would ask for the Bible. He would read a psalm, talk about the psalm, or he'd read a passage and talk about it. So you have that daily prayer, Bible study, and that's their life. That's their whole life. So that was all passed down through the family until we get to Corrie, and she and Betsy were unmarried, and they when the war breaks out in 1940 for Holland, uh, they just realized, gosh, all of our Jewish neighbors are kind of disappearing. Their businesses are being closed. She couldn't figure it out. And so eventually they put two and two together and they talked to people and they found out the Jews were being snatched and taken away, and some to concentration camps, some to be killed. So her family decided, hey, we have to do our part and to help, hide some of them. And so a woman knocks on the door one night, and it's this Jewish woman. She just stays for the night. Next night, there's another knock on their back door, another Jewish woman, because they'd heard how the Ten Booms were this godly family that loved Jews. And so, like the first real person, as I mentioned, person that stays there is Hans Poli. He comes in, and they actually had to hide two groups of people, not just Jews, but Dutch boys also had to hide as well, because if you're a Dutch boy between about 15 to about 30 or 35 or something, the Germans desperately need men to work in the German factories because all their men are at war. So they would snatch Dutch boys off the street, and in other occupied countries, but they would just snatch them off the street in what they called a razzia and kidnap them and put them on a train and ship them to Germany, typically never to be seen again. In fact, that happened to one of Corrie's nephews who was snatched in a raid, was sent to a factory, never to be seen again. So those people had to hide too. So on any given day, the Ten Booms might be hiding 3 Jews and 3 Dutch divers, as they were called. Divers meaning going underground.
Going underground,
So,
yeah.
so that's how they got into it. That's how they started. And then, as I mentioned, Hans gets them involved deeper in the resistance because he felt like, I'm a Dutchman, I have to help my country. So he secretly joined the resistance, and they gave him a gun, which, by the way, was a capital crime under Nazi law, just having a gun. They gave him a gun. They told him to shadow a Gestapo agent, and he can put two and two together. They're calling on me to assassinate this guy. He's 18. He's not even a soldier.
Yeah.
But he felt like he had to do his part. So anyway, he felt like, I've got to tell Corrie because this puts their family at risk. I'm living in their home, and if I'm doing all this stuff and I get caught, they're going to trace it back to where I live, where I was staying, and then the family's going to be at risk. So I have to tell Corrie, and he thought she'd be upset. So when he tells her all this, she goes, "Oh, that's great. Well, I want to be involved. I want to help you. Use our home as your headquarters." And then they're off to the races.
So the Germans, okay, World War II began in 1939, September of 39, when Hitler invaded Poland. And now, obviously, there was a couple things before that time. He had taken over parts of Austria, the Sudetenland, and places like that. And so he was making his move early in the late 30s, and then really the whole thing kind of broke loose in September of 39 when he invaded Poland. He immediately turned and went, that was going east, the course from Germany, and then he turned west and took over the Netherlands. The Dutch they really never had much of a resistance. I don't think they had much of an army. Certainly weren't up to fighting with the Germans and their blitzkrieg warfare that they employed. So when did the Germans actually end up in Holland?
May 1940.
So it was very shortly after. Really, it was the next year. 6 months later, something like that, where they were invading now more Western Europe.
Yeah, and then they went into Belgium and just kept progressing.
They progressed down, and they ultimately took over. When did they get into France?
Oh, it's I don't remember the exact date when they crossed and went over, but it's a year later, I think.
40, 41, something like it was later. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So, but they were the first ones that they basically conquered were the Dutch and the Belgians, and that was pretty easy because these guys are not big countries, number one, and they never were
Right.
necessarily having a huge resistance. But it
And
took
by
him.
the way, part of it was Hitler had promised Queen Wilhelmina and the Dutch that he would never invade Holland. He had promised that. And so they had that kind of, okay, well, if we stay neutral, he's promised. Well, of course, he broke his promise.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Queen Wilhelmina was the sitting queen of Holland.
She's an important character. She's not another reason I felt like I had to write my book was because she's not in the hiding place. And Wilhelmina was a huge person in that whole story for the Dutch because Queen Wilhelmina was for the Dutch what Winston Churchill was for the British.
Yeah, no,
She was their strength. They loved her.
that became very clear as I read this book, and I have to say I did not know who Queen Wilhelmina was until I read your book. So when the Germans got into Holland, they did what they were doing in other places. They were rounding up the Jews. They had this horrible antipathy toward all things Jewish, and I do find that the philo-Semitism that the Ten Booms manifested ultimately, which caused them to lose some members of that family, namely Casper was, I think, the first to go, the 80-year-old father of Corrie. But they had this deep, abiding sense of the Jewish people, that philo-Semitism, which is very interesting because Europe has not traditionally been a continent that has been kind to the Jews. They're kind of off and on. Sometimes they weren't, but this was a deeper level of appreciation for the Jewish people. That sense that there was that covenant that God had made with Abraham, that those who bless the Jews will be blessed, and those who curse the Jews they suffer for it. And he really taught that. Casper, the father of Corrie, taught that to his family very, very clearly. And so when the Germans began to round up all the Jews, he said, "My goodness, we have got to do something about this." And that was kind of the origins of the whole idea of the hiding place. Tell us a little.
Yeah, and it actually goes a little bit before that because Willem, who is Corey's brother, decided to go to seminary and then he went to graduate school. Back in those days, the German schools were considered the most prestigious. You got the best education. They were the dominant commercial country in Europe. So he went to Germany to get a doctorate in theology. This is in 1935. And he's there for 2 or 3 years. Guess what he does his dissertation on? Anti-Semitism in Germany and France.
Amazing.
That's his dissertation while he's in Germany.
Amazing.
I mean, that takes courage just to do that. This is while he's in Germany. But that shows he was sensitive to that and he saw it before anybody else. So when he comes home, he shares that, of course, with the family, what he's done all this research on, and he's seen it firsthand in his time in Germany as well. So he was the part of the information that's coming in to the family about here's what Hitler's really doing. He's going to kill these people.
So Hitler came to power, I think, in 1933,
Wow.
when I think Bismarck basically turned the reins of the chancellorship over to him, and that was at that point
Yep.
he was off the races, and he was building an army at that point too. He was beginning to rebuild Germany. Germany had been decimated by World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, which they were very bitter about. So
Yep.
he had fertile ground to develop his ideology in, put it that way, and he
Yeah.
certainly did it very quickly. So Willem was there in the very early stages of the German the Nazis, the Nazi party, when they weren't really necessarily in gigantic power, but that happened pretty quickly. Was
Yeah.
he there for Kristallnacht? Was he actually there that during that?
I don't think he was. I think that was in 39. I think he had been back for a year or two. So he did not witness that personally.
Okay, okay, because that would have been very jarring for him to actually see
Oh, of
that
course, no question.
directly. So he was part of that thread, and so when Corrie began to they began to think carefully, and they made this thing that they ultimately called the hiding place. Tell us a little bit about that. And by the
Sure.
way, they were we should also say the name of the book is called The Watchmaker's Daughter. Tell us why did you call it that, Larry?
Well, as with most of my books, my publisher picks the title. You know, I submit one title and they have a whole committee that says, we're going to change. What about this? And so eventually you agree. And they wanted something that it was significant that there were two parts. Number one, her lineage. Her father was a watchmaker and probably the best in the world at that time. And Willem would have been the natural heir to that. Willem said, I don't want to be dad, love you, but I don't want to be a watchmaker. I want to be a theologian. So he goes with his dad's blessing to Germany. Corrie, on the other hand, said, well, I do. I want to be a watchmaker. Train me. So Casper, happy that one of the family members decides to continue the business, trains her and then sends her to a special school in Switzerland to continue the trade. But that lineage, if you will, of her being the daughter of a watchmaker, as well as she became the first licensed female watchmaker in Holland. So she's a watchmaker. So there you have the title, The Watchmaker's Daughter, and we could have put a subtitle, Who Also Became a Watchmaker. But that's how the title came about.
Yeah, and they had a very prominent shop there in Harlem. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, her dad was famous. Her dad was famous throughout not only Holland, he was definitely considered the best in Holland, but throughout most of Europe. He had been the president of the International Watchmakers Society, so he was very well known.
Casper was, and he made watches for some royalty too. I mean, that was clear in your book as well. He made some very very prominent individuals their watches. Is that?
Well, yeah, the watch that you're referring to, he actually was the broker for that. The watch was already created. It had been created for I think a prince in Austria, and he lost his title and couldn't afford it. So that special watch Casper knew about and got a buyer for it. So he got a huge commission, which, by the way, was the money that he used to send Corrie to the watchmaking school in Switzerland.
That's right. That's right. That was how that came out. So here we go. They have this family of watchmakers. They're living in Holland. The Germans have come and they've taken over. They're rounding up the Jews. These guys say they're philo-Semitic. They love the Jews. They have a heart for them. They make a place in their house. It was like 3 or 4 story, I guess like a brownstone. I guess you would think about it in like New York brownstone. So tell us about the hiding place.
Sure. So as I mentioned, Hans Poli's the first permanent person in there to live there. And then they started bringing in a couple of Jews, then a couple other Dutch divers. And they live in this old house. The bottom floor is the retail for the watch business. The second 2 floors are for residential. Corrie's room was on the very top, on the 3rd floor. And they felt like, look, the Germans are raiding homes, looking for Jews, or more particular in their area, looking for Dutch divers, looking for these boys that they can snatch. So they're doing raids, collecting whatever they can find. If we get a Jew, fine. If we get a Dutch boy, fine, we'll send them off. So these raids are happening. So they had to figure out, how do we hide? If they come in the house, they're going to find us. They're going to look under the beds. They're going to look in the closets. They're going to find us. And so Hans said, Corrie, we have to create a hiding place, because it'll be 2 minutes and they'll be up on the 3rd floor and they'll catch us all. So he found the attic. Hans found the attic in the 3rd floor and opened it and said, okay, maybe we could use the attic. And then he goes, no, that'll be the first place they look when the Gestapo comes. Hey, here's an attic. So he nailed it shut, and he went to another part of the house on the 3rd floor and drilled a new hole, or carved a new hole that they could use to get up into. but they tested it and it took too long, and they've got all these people that have got to go up this ladder, so it wouldn't work from the time standpoint. So they said, okay, well, that's out. So Hans didn't know what to do. Well, I've already tried this. Not, what can we do? And Corrie said, well, I know somebody who might be able to help us. And so Herman Slurring, who is this guy that's involved in the resistance, she doesn't know that. She just knows he's very powerful, wealthy guy who was always help people. So she asked him, hey, who can you get somebody to help us? So this guy, Herman Slurring, sends an architect over, walks through the house, and a resistance. This is someone involved in the resistance. Walks through the house, gets up to her floor and gets into her room and says, "This is it. This is where we're going to put the hiding place." And Corey's like, "What?" He goes, "Well, this is where we're going to build it." She goes, "Well, this is my bedroom." He goes, "I don't care. This is the best place. By the time the Gestapo gets up here, everybody will already be in the hiding place." So what he did is they built a false wall at the end of where her room was. They built a wall in front of that was basically the size of a closet, but they bricked in part of it, and then they put a wooden fake linen closet on one end, and down the very bottom they had a trap door that was very specialized, great feat of architecture. It was silent. They put rubber in there. They had it on wheels. So anyway, they could slide it up and down. And so that became the hiding place. And then Corrie started testing the times, how long it took, because there might be 7 people there at one time. And this thing could hold, I think it was 8 was the absolute total max. And sometimes they had more than 8 people in the home, which means that they would have to go to the roof and jump across to the next building, which that happens in the story. I won't spoil it, but that does happen in the story.
Yeah.
Because there's not enough room to put anybody else in the hiding place.
So
But the hiding place itself was a disaster. It's the size of a closet. There's no ventilation. There's no heat in there. It's a nightmare.
Yeah, but I guess if you're hiding from the Nazis, you'll take what you get.
Right. They didn't know how long they would have to hide in there, which became a problem. Again, I won't spoil it, but they were thinking we'll just be in here for the raid. That'll take all of 20 minutes, then we'll be back out. Oh no.
Yeah.
Not Germans leave guards in your house.
So they eventually got caught, and eventually they got taken to concentration camps, the whole family. Casper goes to, where did Casper go?
Well, they first were in transition to a concentration camp called Wood, which was almost a way station before they sent people to big concentration camps. So Wood is in Holland. And so they're there for, I think they were there for like maybe 7 months or 8 months or something. And then from there, they get shipped out to, Corrie and Betsy are shipped out to Ravensbrück.
And Casper
dies there.
And Casper, did he pass in Holland? Did he pass to the first?
Yes, at that Wood camp, concentration camp.
Okay, now he was in his 80s, I think, at that point in time. So he was.
Yeah, I think it was 84 at the time he died.
Okay, and he was of ill health at that point in time too. So it didn't take much to put him. And then Betsy and Corrie went to Ravensbrück. They were starved. They had no clothing and everything, and ultimately Betsy died. She died. Did she have tuberculosis, or what did she die from?
She died from what Ravensbrück does to people. And I covered this at great length in Codename Lise, because Odette was there for a very long time, and I had to research. I mean, I have books just on Ravensbrück because I needed to know everything about what happened there. And it's the most notorious nightmare. So on any given, go into a barracks, and they've always got, like, Corrie's barracks was supposed to house like something like 80 people. Well, they would have 400 in there. And so everything was overcrowded. And of course, they're on starvation rations. So it was easy for everybody to get typhoid or some kind of disease or edema, or if nothing else, you're just going to starve to death, because they would give you the minimum rations to keep you alive to do work. And so if you didn't have a strong consistency going in, you're not going to make it. And Betsy Corrie was kind of a tough woman. She was big. strong. And Betsy was not. Betsy was frail. She was not a tomboy like Corrie was. She wasn't athletic. She didn't work out, and so she was already weak going in.
Yeah.
4 years older than Corrie. So when you're at Ravensbrück and you're an older person and you're put through that, you're starved, you're overworked, you've got exhaustion, you're probably going to get some type of typhus, and so you die from all of that. So I don't know that they pinned it on one thing, but she was wasting away. As soon as she can't feel her legs, they have to carry her on a stretcher. She goes to their little hospital there, and it just progresses, and her condition deteriorates.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the loss of life and just the living conditions in these concentration camps was just unbelievable. So Corrie makes it out of the war. The war ends. Actually, the miracle was that she got out of that camp. It was a mistake how she even got out of the camp. Yeah. And then the war ends, and then something, and I did not know this about this woman, something remarkable that she did. She realized that during the war, or during this whole thing, first of all, she had an amazing attitude toward the people that she was dealing with. There were a couple of people who were absolutely impossible, who treated her very, very badly, but she had an incredible heart. I mean, I have to say, in terms of, as a Christian myself, I look at this and I talk about, loving your enemies. She really kind of manifested that. But after the war, she opened this home. And I'd like you to share a little bit about this, because this to me was really remarkable.
Sure. The beginning of that is really, again, Casper. Casper loved everybody. And there's one scene in the book where he sees some Germans beating some Jews and throwing them in a truck. And Casper says, makes a comment, or Corrie said something, "Oh, those poor people." And Casper says, "Oh, yes, those poor people, they've touched the apple of God's eye." Casper saying the poor Germans, because they're going to suffer the wrath, God's wrath from what they're doing. But Casper's always thinking, very altruistic, always thinking about other people. So that passes along through the family to Betsy and Corrie. Betsy was an absolute saint, So they just love everybody. They love people, and they do their best to live the Christian life and so forth. So by the time, so when they're in prison, and Betsy starts to have these health problems, she essentially starts counseling Corrie, and she says, "Corrie, when we leave," she thinks that she's going to make it out, which she doesn't, but she says, "When this is over and we leave, we need to help people." And so her vision was to help people who've been harmed by the war, like people like themselves, people that have been in concentration camps, mothers who've lost all their sons, wives who've lost their husbands, people that were tormented in German factories. So Betsy said, "Look, you have millions of people that are going to need help, emotional help, spiritual help, physical help." And so she said, "We need to start a home in Holland to help people. And then when that's set up, we need to help the Germans. There's 9 million Germans that are homeless. Same thing there. Wives that lost their husbands, mothers that lost their sons. We need to help them. They're the most hurt people of all. They've got a country in ruins. We need to help them too." So the long and short of, so Betsy dies, but Corrie never forgets that passion and that vision that Betsy had and felt like that was her calling. So she starts that first home in Holland to help people. But there were actually 3. There was the original home, which was a mansion, which had kind of been donated to her for this purpose, where they housed people that had been hurt, Dutchmen who had been hurt by the war, people that had been betrayed, because your next door neighbor could have betrayed you to the Nazis and sent you're off to the concentration camp. So you've got forgiveness issues that you're trying to, come back to.
Sure.
So she builds this home, or she has this home in Holland for them. And she tried to you had the traitors, you had the Quislings, the people that did turn in their neighbors. And so the Dutch people wanted no part of them. These were the traitors. Corrie was subject to one of them, guy that had resulted in all of their arrests. Corrie first tried to put him in that home, and the people there said, "We don't want them. Get them out. We hate these people." So what did Corrie do? She moves into that home, and she moves those people that were the Quislings, the betrayers. She moves them into her home, the Bayet,
Yeah.
because Betsy's gone and Casper's gone, and so she moves those people into her own home. So that's home convalescent home number 2, and then not forgetting what Betsy said about helping the Germans, she goes to Germany to minister to people that have been harmed by the war, and there's a whole saga about she's in a factory, she moves in where 100 people live, 100 families live, and it's a nightmare, and then one day this guy shows up and he says, "Hey, I've heard about what you've done. We have a place that you might be able to do one of these convalescent centers. I heard about your place in Holland." So she goes, it's a former concentration camp. It's Darmstadt, which was a concentration camp, which they have no use for now. And the guy says, "Look, it's yours if you want to use it for your, to help the Germans." And so she does, and she builds it. She makes it really nice. Of course, they take out all the barbed wire. They paint everything.
Yeah.
She puts flowers in all the window sills, flowers around the place to make it nice. So she does those convalescent centers in 3 different places.
So I think it's so amazing that this woman who basically lost several members of her family to the Nazis and the Germans would turn around and go back to Germany and
Yeah.
and basically transform a former concentration camp into this home of healing, this home of, of restitution and reconciliation. When I read that,
if you look in the book, I've got pictures of both the before and after of Darmstadt.
Yeah, no, I saw that, and I just have to say that to me was almost hard for me to really take in, because I'm thinking about this. I'm kind of going, what would I do? Well, I would have probably been embittered. I would have been angry. I would have probably, I think that was the response of so many people, but the German people were likewise, and when you think about it, they were radically traumatized by what happened in their own country, and I think that a lot of them feel like they were. I mean, the fact that they were, had followed Hitler basically off the edge of the world, because Germany was completely destroyed after during the war. They had a lot of healing to go through, and I frankly I actually think that healing is still taking place in Germany today. I hate to say it, but I think it is.
In fact, the sad part of that is most Germans were not Nazis. The Nazis was a very small political party that just took power and just made everything mandatory. But the vast majority, and I talk about it in my last 3 books, The Watchmaker's Daughter, The Princess Spy, and Codename Lise, because it comes into the story. The German military tried to kill Hitler for years. They tried all these coups. I mean, the famous one is Valkyrie. If you see the movie and you have Tom Cruise, playing von Schaffenberg, people know about that. But the vast majority of the Germans were not Nazis and despised them like we do. The German military, the Wehrmacht, despised Hitler. They figured out who he was early on, and they tried to kill him, to get him out of office, to arrest him for years. So, and many of them, thousands, gave their lives, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the famous German pastor and theologian who gave his life as part of the conspiracy to get rid of Hitler. So thousands of Germans gave their lives to try to get rid of Hitler. And so they have broken homes just like everyone else. So
they needed help, and she actually provided that help. Amazing. Listen, friends, this is an incredible story. Corrie ten Boom is a woman of incredible courage, and I am, Larry, I have to say, I am so happy that you in particular did this research and brought this story in such a readable and wonderful way. I have to say, I read it and I enjoyed every page of this book, because every page I was learning something, and you did an excellent job. So, friends, this is a recently published book called The Watchmaker's Daughter. Larry Loftis. I think we're gonna end our conversation. I'm watching our time. We're gonna end our conversation here. But Larry, how can people find you?
They can, in fact, if you go onto the back of the book, it's got my website and all that. So I'm on all social media, the books everywhere at any outlet. I mean, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all the bookstores have it, so you can order it anywhere. LarryLoftis.com is my website, and you can see backgrounds and interviews. I was at the Reagan Library, so we got a clip of that on there. I was on Huckabee, so there's a clip on that on there. So I've got interviews and other things that I've done on the website. So, and I'm on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and all that too.
He's pretty easy to find, you guys. Loftis is spelled Loftis, by the way. So Larry Loftis, the author of The Watchmaker's Daughter. Larry, thank you for taking the time to be on my show today. You've been fabulous, and really appreciate the work that you've done in writing this book. So best wishes to you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hamilton. Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure.
And one last question I want to say, because my show is where kids and culture collide, and we talked about this on our pre-conversation. There's a lot of evil in the world. There was a lot of evil in World War II. How do we as parents approach evil with our children? How do we actually talk about that and deal with that? Because there are things that are very bad that happened. Give us your take on that.
Well, I mean, if you've got a Christian family, you have to start with the basics, what the Bible says, and that's that we live in a fallen world. Ever since Genesis 3, we live in a fallen world, and there's evil everywhere. I mean, you see evil in the Bible on every page, just about. So evil exists, and Paul warns about it, of course, in Ephesians 6. So I think it's prudent to teach people, look, there is a side of this world that's bad, and here's where it comes from. Here's how it originates. So if kids know that, okay, there's evil in the world, I've been trained, my parents or my church, my pastor, whoever, have trained me to think biblically on how to respond. And that's always, you got to weigh, how do you respond? Do you just leave? Do you walk the other way? Do you fight them? And that's what Dietrich Bonhoeffer had to deal with, by the way. He had a cushy seminary job in the U.S. He could have just stayed there. He felt like, no, I can't, as a Christian man, I cannot stay here while my country's being destroyed. And I have to go there and I have to help however I can help. It may cost him my life, which it did cost him his life. But he felt like that's my calling as a Christian. I have to help prevent evil. And he gives the famous analogy. He said, if you see a madman driving his car down the sidewalk, running over people, killing people, you can't just say, oh, those poor people, I'll pray for them. No, you have to help and stop that car, get that madman. And if you don't, you've got to answer to God for sitting on the sidelines while all this is happening. So
that's a good answer. I think that when we have to let our kids know that there's evil in the world. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious. But dealing with evil, some of this is really evil, and sometimes it's hard to talk to about this stuff with your children. But it's important that we do. So, Larry, we will end it there. Thank you for taking the time again. It's been a pleasure talking with you and meeting you over Zoom. Hopefully, our paths will cross in the flesh. If you come to California, you're always welcome to come by and we'll meet each other. So friends, you have been listening today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. We've been speaking with Larry Loftis. He's the author of The Watchmaker's Daughter. Fabulous read. I recommend it to everybody. Very eminently readable, even readable to your young teenagers as well. So pick it up. Larry, thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And for all of you listening, thank you for being here. Until next time, be well. Bye-bye.
You have been listening to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of your day. Tune in again next week on Apple Podcast. Rate and comment and tell a friend.